President Trump is insisting there will not be a trade war in response to his plan to impose new tariffs on steel and aluminum. This morning, in a series of tweets, the president defended his plan, saying the U.S. must protect American steel, but said he would only scrap it if a new and, quote, fair, unquote, NAFTA agreement is signed. He doubled down on that position this afternoon in the Oval Office.
We've had a very bad deal with Mexico, a very bad deal with Canada. It's called NAFTA. Our factories have left our country. Our jobs have left our country. For many years, NAFTA has been a disaster. We are renegotiating NAFTA, as I said I would. And if we don't make a deal, I'll terminate NAFTA. But if I do make a deal, which is fair to the workers and to the American people, that would be, I would imagine, one of the points that we'll negotiate. It will be tariffs on steel for Canada and for Mexico.
The president's efforts to impose new tariffs have been widely condemned by economic experts and could cause repercussions around the world. Joining me now is James Hohmann, national political reporter for The Washington Post. Welcome, James. So the president is saying that he's going to drop the tariffs in exchange for a fair NAFTA deal. First of all, what does NAFTA have to do with the tariffs that he's imposed, and what specifically does fair mean?
Well, yeah, Deborah, those are great questions that we don't really know the answer to because the president kind of has been all over the place. It does, the tariffs that he announced last week really hurt Canada pretty badly. Canada, in some ways, is the biggest loser under those tariffs. They're very, very upset. They're threatening all sorts of retaliation against the United States that could make a host of things we buy more expensive. But it also undercuts the stated rationale for the tariffs last week. Last week, Trump said, and the legal thing that they're using is that this is a national security threat to the United States, that we were putting in place these tariffs because the U.S. needed steel and aluminum for warships, for example, and pulling NAFTA into it from a court of law perspective, and the World Trade Organization is certain to litigate this, it undercuts the argument. It shows that this actually isn't about national security. This is just kind of straight up old-fashioned protectionism.
So what's fascinating is that the tariffs, by saying, no, we need a fair deal with NAFTA, it does not address the countries that President Trump has essentially said are the cheaters, which is China, that artificially suppresses the cost of its steel and aluminum. So what does it have to do with China? Where does China come into all of this? Yeah,
so what's crazy about these tariffs is that the biggest losers are America's closest allies. And that's why it's not just Republicans on Capitol Hill who are angry. It's also a lot of folks at the Defense Department and the State Department who really feel like Trump is actively messing up our relationships with countries like Australia. On the Sunday shows, Peter Navarro, who's Trump's sort of most hard-line protectionist advisor, he was saying we're not going to make any exceptions even for countries like Australia. And so when you look at sort of the raw economic impact, China is going to end up getting off the hook relative to Australia and Canada and Europe and other close allies, South Korea.
What's interesting is you look there, we've got a graphic up that shows the tariffs would be 25% steel, 10% aluminum. When we think about these kinds of tariffs, it affects the people who are actually buying the steel. And it almost seems that this is a fight between the buyers of steel and aluminum on one hand, right? Boeing, General Motors, Anheuser-Busch on one side, and those who want to make steel and aluminum on the other, the people that really represent the president's base.
Yeah, well, there are a lot of statistics now. A lot of nonpartisan economists have crunched the numbers, and they've concluded that objectively, far more jobs are going to be lost because of these tariffs than are going to be created. We're no longer an industrial economy. I think Donald Trump, who's in his 70s, remembers the United States of the 1950s. And you're right. These are popular. We have reporters who've been in Western Pennsylvania and, Ohio and the Rust Belt. And voters are excited to hear the news of these tariffs. But the new economy, the services economy, and you're right, the auto manufacturing, beer manufacturing, they are very, very upset about it. There's a lot more jobs in places that use metals than produce metals in 2018. Over the last 20 years, 75,000 steel jobs have been lost in the United States. Now, I should say that's why Trump says we need these tariffs, but it also kind of reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of what the U.S. economy is about at this point in time.
Now, Speaker Paul Ryan's spokeswoman said of these tariffs that they're extremely worried about the consequences of a trade war. And the spokesperson went on to say that they don't want to jeopardize economic gains made this year with the passage of the tax plan. Now, what gains are they worried about, right, under the tax plan? And what can Congress do to actually prevent these tariffs from actually moving forward?
So tariffs basically are taxes. You know, in your introductory college economics course, you learn that a tariff is basically a tax. And so they cut $1.5 trillion in taxes as part of the tax bill. And this is probably, $200 billion of a tax increase to offset the gains. So it's not necessarily, the tax bill that passed in December cuts corporate taxes a great deal, and this hurts a lot of corporations. It could slow the stock market gain. A trade war could hurt the economy, could cause the Federal Reserve to change fiscal policy, monetary policy, And so there's a host of things there. On the second point about what Congress can do, Congress could pass a law that essentially ties the president's hands. The president is using authorities that were given to him under laws that go back as far as the 1950s, that national security kind of point that I made. He's using this national security loophole to call it. So Paul Ryan could close that. It is interesting because a lot of things the president does, Republicans are unwilling to take action on Capitol Hill. But this is something that really gets to who they are. The reason a lot of people became conservatives, the free market, they see this as an affront to that.
And you talk about national security, and the defense secretary said that this could hurt U.S. relations with America's closest allies. But you had the Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, saying that the market would likely tank, which we saw happen on Friday. And also the president's closest advisor, Gary Cohn, threatened to quit. So you've got this sort of war brewing inside. But I want to talk about the midterms. Republicans right now running for re-election will not be able to tout the strong economy and that tax plan that you just mentioned. If there's retaliation for the president's tariffs, could it be a problem for Republicans heading into the midterm?
Yeah, absolutely. There are certain places where politically this will help. I mentioned Western Pennsylvania, Ohio. There's a special election next Tuesday in rural Pennsylvania, an area where Trump did really well, that traditionally Democrats did well. And it's actually possible that these tariffs could help the Republican pull out a neck-and-neck race. But there are a lot of states that are really dependent on trade, and especially NAFTA. Some of the most important Senate races in 2018 are on border states, not with Mexico, although that's true. There are Senate races in Arizona and Nevada, but North Dakota, Montana, places like that. And those states are very pro-trade. They're very agriculture heavy, and farmers are some of the people who are most worried about these tariffs. And so Democrats absolutely, unquestionably will run in those farm states and the red states against the tariffs. And it could help them. It could put Republicans in a tough spot.
So, James, you mentioned the Democrats, right? And you write today the Democratic committees are divided over the priorities heading into the midterms. You see already this huge infighting between people who identify as Democrats going after one another as opposed to sort of, people over party. What are the big issues within the Democratic Party?
Yeah, so there's so much enthusiasm on the left right now. People are obviously dislike Trump. There's a record number of candidates who are running. There's just all this energy. But what that means is when you have a record number of candidates running in some of these races, the really competitive House races that Democrats have to win a majority in the House, there's 11 or 14 or 17 candidates. And so some of the Democrats who are focused on trying to win the majority in Washington are saying some of these people are first-time candidates. They are unelectable. They have really extreme positions that won't fly in suburban, moderate districts. And so the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, which is the campaign arm controlled by Nancy Pelosi, weighed in ahead of this Texas primary tomorrow and said this one woman whose husband worked for Bernie Sanders is too extreme. She wrote a magazine piece a couple years ago saying she would never live in Texas. She wouldn't be caught dead at her grandparents' house in Paris, Texas. And they're saying this is toxic. This woman could never win an election in Texas in a general election. And they didn't endorse another candidate. They just said, don't vote for this woman. And then in an interview with me, the chairman of the Democratic National Committee, the DNC, Tom Perez, he said, I wouldn't have done that. That was a mistake. It's really bad because it looks like we're anointing candidates, especially after the 2016 election when Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton went toe-to-toe. And a lot of Bernie supporters came away from that feeling like the system was rigged and the scale was tipped in favor of Hillary. So there's tension among Washington Democrats about how far to go to make sure that candidates who can actually win these primaries make it through. Remember, Republicans had this problem during the Obama era. In 2010 and 2012, they nominated a lot of extreme candidates in places like Delaware, Christine O'Donnell, or Todd Akin in Missouri, who were very, very conservative but could never win in a general election.
Yeah, it's always interesting to watch the primaries when you have the candidates sort of destroying themselves, as one would say, eating their own young. So we will see who is left standing. James Hohmann, thank you.
My pleasure.